Hello, West Ham fans. Here's another quick video from me, and it's really been on my mind a lot recently. When you listen to TalkSport or the BBC or whatever it is, and everyone says how experienced David Moyes is and how good a manager he is. And so, what I wanted to do is actually go through the stats from the Premier League website and see how true is that? Because everyone keeps saying it, but no one's ever really backed it up for me. So I thought the best way to do that was maybe compare him to some of the best managers, like a Guardiola or a Arteta, but also compare him to some of the newer managers that are now in the Premier League and see how his record stacks up. Because I firmly believe that experience doesn't mean you're good. Just because you've been doing it like David Moyes has for 19 years, the pundits are saying that that makes him the most experienced manager to get us out of this trouble. But when you look at the numbers, they actually tend to disagree with that. So let's get dug in and start comparing him versus various other managers. Firstly, let's look at Mikel Arteta from Arsenal, who's done a fantastic job in his first 4 seasons there. And believe me, as a West Ham fan, it's definitely difficult to say anything good about Arsenal. But let's look at some of his stats and compare them to David Moyes. And I think there's a couple of really interesting things here. So obviously, this season, he's the best manager in the Premier League, at the moment. Let's see what happens in the last few weeks of the season here. But his win percentage is 57% across 4 seasons, compared to David Moyes at 39%. His loss rate is 27%, compared to David Moyes at 35%. So losing slightly less games, but the real difference maker is the number of, he's not having as many draws as David Moyes is. And that really, puts him at a really respectable percentage for the win rate. I think the other interesting thing is, David Moyes is always considered a defensive manager, but Arteta is actually letting in less goals on average than Moyes is. So he's at 1.08 games, 1.08 goals conceded per game, and David Moyes is at 1.27. So the defensive manager that everyone keeps talking about with David Moyes is actually not that good compared to an Arteta. But really, the difference maker on the other side is goals scored per game, where Arteta's really quite considerably outperforming Moyes at 1.75 goals per game versus David Moyes' 1.3. I thought this was a really interesting comparison. Now, obviously, Arsenal have more money to spend typically than West Ham, and so have some really big name signings. So it might, a lot of pundits might say, oh, well, it's not fair to compare his stats versus David Moyes at West Ham and most of his career at Everton. But it's interesting to see those stats and to compare them and actually realize that Arteta is better defensively and better on the attack, leading to a much higher win percentage than David Moyes has. Next up is Pep Guardiola at Man City. Now, obviously, everyone's going to say, well, this is a totally different league. But I think we should compare our manager versus the best in the league. And Pep has definitely been the most consistent of the recent game compared to any other manager. So let's look at his stats here. And so he's been managing for 7 seasons now. His win rate is an incredible 74%. That is insane. I had to check that many times when I was looking at that, because I was like, that blows me away, that 3/4 of the games he's winning and only losing 13% of the time. That is crazy. And that is what a world-class manager is. And then the difference maker as well, again, is both on goals scored per game and on the defensive. So he's even better than Arteta on the defensive record at 0.8 goals conceded per game versus David Moyes at 1.27. And then on the goals scored per game, he's at 2.49 goals per game versus David Moyes' 1.33. So over a goal more per game than David Moyes scores. And conceding a considerably less goals per game than David Moyes. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, again, this is not a fair comparison. He's the best. He's Man City. He's got near enough unlimited budget. So let's compare to a couple of other managers that might be more comparable to David Moyes or more comparable to the West Ham job. So with that in mind, let's compare him to Emery at Aston Villa. Now, he's only been managing for 3 Premier League seasons. So, obviously considerably less data points than David Moyes, right? Who's done, nearly 650 games compared to Emery's 68 games. But interestingly enough, look at the stats here. The win percentage for Emery is 53% compared to Moyes' 39%. The loss percentage is 25% compared to Moyes' 35%. And then the goals scored per game is 1.78 versus 1.33. So nearly scoring, like 0.4, nearly half a goal per more per game than David Moyes scores. And then a very comparable goals conceded per game. So 1.32 goals per game conceded versus David Moyes at 1.27. So really very comparable on that front, like defensively. Again, David Moyes known for his defensive record and everything. He's not really outperforming Emery at Aston Villa. And if anything, it's showing up that, the defensive play is a real negative for the attacking side of things in terms of David Moyes' stats versus all of these managers on a goals scored per game as well. And lastly, I wanted to compare David Moyes to Brendan Rodgers. So lots has been talked about, could Brendan Rodgers come in and do a better job, and how bad a job he was doing at Leicester. I think the interesting thing is David Moyes has spent, like nearly £200 million in the last 12 to 18 months. And Leicester was going in the other direction. They were selling all their best players and not giving Brendan Rodgers any budget to replace them or anything. So the media makes a big comparison about he wasn't doing any better at Leicester, etc. They're in the bottom 3, whatever it is. But it's a very different story in terms of spending trajectory and support from ownership that West Ham have had in a positive direction compared to Leicester that was going in completely the other way. And I think the pundits often forget this, but let's look at his stats here. So Brendan Rodgers has managed in the Premier League for 10 seasons, so a decent amount of data points that you can really compare against. The win percentage is 45%, so he's 6 percentage points higher than David Moyes in terms of the win percentages. Very comparable on the loss percentages at 33% for Brendan Rodgers and 35% for David Moyes. I think interestingly enough, with the difference again is goals scored is a pretty decent amount higher, 1.7 versus David Moyes' 1.33. And the goals conceded per the game is very comparable, a little bit higher for Brendan Rodgers, 1.32 per game versus David Moyes' 1.27. So it's funny, his track record at Leicester got him fired. And you look at David Moyes over a very long period of time, and the stats are not in David Moyes' favor when you look at any of these sort of things. So I think it's very interesting just to kind of look at all these different managers and, really support it with data, because the pundits say all this stuff and it's really frustrating as a West Ham fan. You're looking there, you're watching the game every week, and you know that the stats support what you're thinking, but the media is just totally blind to it. And so I thought this video would really help just kind of shine a little bit more of a light on his record as a manager over a very long career, and really support some upcoming videos that I have coming out. And you see it all across YouTube right now, with fans expressing real dissatisfaction with David Moyes. And I hope the media can start to look actually at some of these stats, and instead of just saying he's a good manager or he's the best manager for us at the moment and for this type of predicament or whatever it might be, really think about, like, does the fact that 19 years in the Premier League, does that really mean he's a good manager? because good is very different to experienced.